So we're picking up in our Chapter 22 video notes with developing a colonial policy. And when we left off in the last video, we ended the Spanish-American War with the Treaty of Paris, the 1898 Treaty of Paris, which gave Cuba their independence from Spain, gave the United States temporary control of Cuba, and Spain ceded colonial authority over Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippine Islands. So almost overnight, the United States had obtained a substantial overseas empire. And some Americans expressed doubts over the acquisition of the Philippines. But of course, there were expansionists who wanted to annex the whole archipelago. Those who favored annexation said that the Philippines would be good markets, and it would be even a gateway to the markets of the Far East, because remember, interest during this time was directed toward Latin America and the Far East. And those who favored annexing the Philippines thought that maybe this will give us access to the Far East. So many Americans, including the president, were swayed by the principle of basically holding on to what we can get. And this was met by some anti-imperialism. So one good thing about the Spanish-American War was that it brought like a unifying patriotism. And after the sectionalism caused by the Civil War, this served to unify the people in a patriot fervor, I guess, that helped further sectional reconciliation. But there were some new and divisive questions. There was a diverse group of politicians and business and labor leaders, some intellectuals who spoke out against annexing the Philippines. And some of them based their opposition on legal and ethical concerns. And for some, there were racial and ethnic prejudices that formed the basis of their objections. But in the end, McKinley was swayed by a sense of duty and practical concerns, and so he authorized the purchase of the Philippines from Spain for $20 million. And after a hard-fought battle in the Senate, the expansionists won ratification of the treaty in February 1899. There were, however, some Philippine nationalists who were not happy with the United States now having control of the Philippines. So this led to Philippine insurrection. So early in 1899, Philippine nationalists led by a guy named Emilio, I'm not even sure how to say this last name, Aguinaldo or something like that. It's probably not pronounced. I don't know though, maybe it is Aguinaldo, I'm not sure. But the nationalists were led by him, and they took up arms against the Americans and against American occupation. And there were, of course, atrocities committed on both sides, and they became commonplace, stories of rape and murder and arson. And this really became ammunition for the anti-imperialists. The stories of American casualties and even reports of atrocities committed by American soldiers, again, gave ammunition to the anti-imperialists. But at any rate, McKinley's re-election pretty much settled the Philippine question for most Americans. There were 70,000 American soldiers that had to be sent to the Philippines to crush the rebellion. And in this conflict, 8,000 Filipinos died. At the end of it, they sent William Howard Taft, our one-termer, the hand-chosen successor of Theodore Roosevelt. But Taft became the first civilian governor of the Philippines, and he encouraged the people there to participate in territorial government. And that did win favor with some of the Filipinos, and it won many converts, but it really didn't end the rebellion. So what was the relationship like between the United States and Cuba? Well, first, McKinley established civil governments for Cuba, not only Cuba, but also Puerto Rico and the Philippines. And there was a series of Supreme Court decisions that said that Congress was not bound by the Constitution in administering a colony. And so the United States placed tariffs on Puerto Rican imports and did not give them full citizenship or full local self-government. In Cuba, they were facing poverty, a high rate of illiteracy, the problem of a collapsing economy. And so the United States established a military government in 1898. And the United States, there were some who wanted to annex Cuba, but eventually the United States withdrew. But not before they modernized sugar production, they improved sanitary conditions, they established schools, and they restored orderly administration in Cuba. So those were good things. And in 1900, a Cuban Constitutional Convention was held, and they held that convention without much American interference. And so eventually we reached the Platt Agreement, the Platt Amendment, not the Platt Agreement. And in the Platt Amendment, the Cubans agreed to American intervention when necessary for the preservation of Cuban independence. And Cuba promised to avoid foreign entanglements that might endanger their sovereignty, and they agreed to allow American naval bases on their soil. And there was really only one more time that American troops occupied Cuba in 1906, and then at the request of Cuban authorities. But the threat of intervention and, America was a world economic power. This gave the United States great influence over Cuba. The U.S. in the Caribbean and Central America. So it was pretty much the same motives that compelled the U.S. to intervene in Cuba that applied throughout the region. Caribbean nations were economically underdeveloped, they were socially backward, politically unstable, desperately poor, and they were threatened by their creditor nations in Europe. Lots of debts were owed by these nations to European creditors. So the United States intervened repeatedly in this region, and they did so using a broad interpretation of the Monroe Doctrine. And in 1902, this is just one instance, the United States urged Great Britain and Germany to negotiate a dispute that was arising from debts that were owed to them by Venezuela. And then under Roosevelt's administration, they took control of the Dominican Republic's customs service and used the proceeds to repay that country's European creditors. And so there was something added to the Monroe Doctrine to broaden these powers, the Roosevelt Corollary. And this part of the Monroe Doctrine announced that the United States would not permit foreign nations to intervene in Latin America. And since no other nation could step in, the United States would conveniently exercise, quote, an international police power, or would exercise as an international police power. And so in the short run, that worked well, but in the long run, it really provoked resentment in Latin America. So open door policy in China. So many of the European powers wanted to check Japan's growth, their economic and their military growth, and to do that, they began to carve out spheres of influence in China. And this kind of threatened the United States, or at least compelled them to act. And so Secretary of State Hay issued a series of open door notes. And these basically called for these European powers to honor their existing trade agreements with China and not to impose restrictions on trade within their influence. And so basically the United States wanted to keep the open door policy with China, to keep their trade agreements open. And so this was really not backed by anything. There wasn't any power behind it, this treaty, but it did signal a marked departure from America's isolationist tradition of non-intervention outside of the Western Hemisphere. And so within a few months, this policy was tested by the Boxer Rebellion. The Boxers were a secret group in China that practiced calisthenics, basically boxing. It was probably Christian missionaries that first called them Boxers, but they were rebelling against the spread of Western influence in China and Japanese influence in China. And they got into some weird stuff, practicing spirit possession and the whirling of swords and violent prostrations, chanting incantations to Taoist and Buddhist spirits. But ultimately, they believed that if they trained hard enough, they ate properly, and they prayed, then they could perform extraordinary feats, like flying. But they also claimed that once they went to fight, the spirit soldiers, millions of them, would descend from the heavens and help them purify China of foreign oppression. But they believed that because of their calisthenics, they would have supernatural invulnerability toward rifle shots, knife attacks, and the blows of the cannon. But at any rate, fearing that European powers would use the rebellion as an excuse for further intervention, Hay broadened the open door policy to include support for the territorial integrity of China. And so this American interference in China, along with our diplomatic role in the Russo-Japanese War and the Gentlemen's Agreement of 1907, all caused ill feelings between the United States and Japan. And the Gentlemen's Agreement was just an informal agreement between the U.S. and Japan, whereby we would not impose restriction on Japanese immigration, and Japan would not allow further immigration to the U.S. And the goal was to reduce tensions, but it really didn't reduce tensions, it increased them. The Panama Canal. So American policy in the Caribbean centered on the construction of an interoceanic canal. And this canal was thought to be a necessity for trade and imperative for national security. And so a new treaty was written to override the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which gave the United States and Great Britain this agreement to rights to this waterway. And we sort of replaced that with the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which gave the United States exclusive construction rights to this kind of waterway. And so the U.S. negotiated a treaty for the right to build a canal across Panama with the government of Colombia, which the Colombian Senate rejected. Well, then the Panamanians rebelled against Colombia in 1903, and of course we very quickly recognized and ensured Panama's independence. And then we negotiated a treaty with the new Panamanian government, which gave the U.S. a 10-mile wide canal zone, and for the same monetary terms as those that were rejected by Colombia. So construction began on the Panama Canal. Imperialism without colonies. So the United States experiment with territorial imperialism really only lasted about 10 years. But through the open door policy, the Roosevelt Corollary, the United States used its industrial, economic, and military might to expand its trade and influence. And, there were times when America also engaged in cultural imperialism, trying to export American values and ideals and the American system to weaker nations. But despite all of this, America emerged as a world power, but the national psychology remained the same, and we were fundamentally isolationist despite this 10-year period of expansion. And so that brings our chapter 22 notes to a close.